Jeremiah chapter 40 in the Brown JPS Tanach. It's the auspicious 1111, page 1111 in the middle of the page. And we are in a multi-chapter narrative now that surrounds the destruction of the temple. But as we noted last week, the actual destruction of the temple is not recounted in last week's chapter, but the burning of the king's palace and the homes of residents of Judea and Jerusalem, and the exile of everyone except the lowest class, socioeconomic class or economic class of people. And Gedaliah has been appointed as the vassal governor over the remaining Judeans in the land. At the end of last chapter, we were told that Nebuchadrezzar, also known as Nebuchadnezzar, had given his chief guard, Nebuzaradan, the instructions to keep an eye on Jeremiah. And it seemed like Jeremiah was, released from prison and able to move around freely. At the end of last week's chapter 39, we read about him. Vayeshev betoch ha'am, he dwelt amongst the people. That seemed to indicate some freedom of movement. The beginning of this chapter, we're going to see a slightly different version of that story. There are ways that the two accounts might be harmonized. They may just be conflicting accounts. But we're going to continue to kind of see the waning presence of the remaining Judean community in the land of Israel play out over these subsequent chapters. As we mentioned last week, there are parallel accounts in the end of the book of Jeremiah and also in the book of Kings, the end of 2 Kings. And the focus here is really on kind of Jeremiah's role appropriately, not the overall state of the nation, but a lot is sort of through the lens of Jeremiah's experience. That's how this chapter begins. And let's jump right into it. So chapter 40. Let's see. Graham, do you want to start us off? The word that came to Jeremiah? You're still muted.
All right, great. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guard, set him free at Ramah, to which he had taken him, chained in fetters, among those from Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon. The chief of the guards took charge of Jeremiah, and he said to him, "The Lord your God threatened this place with this disaster, and now the Lord has brought it about. He has acted as he threatened, because you sinned against the Lord and did not obey him. That is why this has happened to you.
Yes.
Now I release you this day from the fetters which were on your hands. If you would like to go with me to Babylon, come, and I will look after you. And if you don't want to come with me to Babylon, you need not go. See, the whole land is before you. Go wherever seems good and right to you." But Jeremiah still did not turn back or go to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, whom the king of Babylon has put in charge of the towns of Judah, and stay with him among the people, or go wherever you want to go. The chief of the guards gave him an allowance of food and dismissed him. So Jeremiah came to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, in Mizpah, and stayed with him among the people who were left in the land. The officers of the troops in the open country and their men with them heard that the king of Babylon had put Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, in charge of the region, and that he had put in his charge the men, women, and children of the poorest in the land, those who had not been exiled to Babylon. So they, with their men, came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, Johanan and Jonathan, the sons of Kareah, Seraiah, son of Tanhumeth, and the sons of Ephi, the Netophathite, and Jesaniah, son of the Makathite. Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, reassured them and their men, saying, "Do not be afraid to serve the Chaldeans. Stay in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you. I am going to stay in Mizpah to attend upon the Chaldeans who will come to us. But you may gather wine and figs and oil and put them in your own vessels and settle in the towns you have occupied." Likewise, all the Judeans who were in Moab, Ammon, and Edom, or who were in other lands, heard that the king of Babylon had let a remnant stay in Judah, and that he had put Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, in charge of them. All these Judeans returned from all the places to which they had scattered. They came to the land of Judah, the Gedaliah at Mizpah, and they gathered large quantities of wine and figs. Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the officers of the troops in the open country came to Gedaliah at Mizpah and said to him, "Do you know that King Baalis of Ammon has sent Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, to kill you?" But Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, would not believe them. Johanan, son of Kareah, also said secretly to Gedaliah at Mizpah, "Let me go and strike down Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, before anyone knows about it. Otherwise he will kill you, and all the Judeans who have gathered about you will be dispersed, and the remnant of Judah will perish." But Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, answered Johanan, son of Kareah, "Do not do such a thing. What are you saying about Ishmael? What you are saying about Ishmael is not true."
Okay, and that's where the chapter ends. And those who know the story know that, spoiler alert, what he was saying about Ishmael was true, and Ishmael is going to ultimately assassinate Gedaliah, and Gedaliah naively or has bad intelligence, does not think that's the case, and we'll see that unfold in the beginning of the next chapter. So it's a bit of a cliffhanger, but we'll leave that for 2 weeks from now. Let's take the opportunity to delve back through the chapter. Again, it's a shorter chapter, 16 verses, and the narrative is not that complex, but there are some important things we want to notice along the way. So start back at the beginning. Yes, it's true. It's still a little bit hard to follow, and there are a few areas where the Hebrew is not clear, and we're making our best guess here about the translation. So let's start. First of all, there's something strange in the very first verse, which is it starts with the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. That's a pretty typical beginning of a chapter in the book of books of prophets. However, we're going to have to keep our eye out in the subsequent handful of verses and see, do we actually see a word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord? So typically, right after a verse that says the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, we get open quote, and we get God's first person, voice. But we're not going to see that. So we're going to have to keep in mind as we read an attempt to understand where is the word of God, which is being introduced at the beginning of this chapter.
Just be emotional that he studied.
Right. So Ruby says, could somehow it just be that a message was internalized without having to have specific words, attached to it? That's a plausible interpretation, but it would be unusual. Usually the word which came to Jeremiah is a way of introducing actual speech. Now, whether the speech was a voice that Jeremiah heard or whether it was just a manifestation, in his heart, we don't know. But the way the books of prophets typically narrate it is with words in first person with God speaking. We don't seem to see that here. So we have to keep that in mind as we open up. What is that referring to when it says the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord? And this is after Nebuzaradan set him free at Ramah, to which he had taken him, chained in fetters, among those from Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon. So we can almost read this backwards, this verse. So we understand that this is a recounting of the exile of the remaining, again, other than the poor who were invited to stay. This is describing the exile that came in the year 586, where the bulk of those who remained in the land were being exiled. We see that they were taken in chains. Jeremiah was in chains along with them. And somehow at Ramah, which is north of Jerusalem, there was like a little, rest stop. And it seems like Nebuzaradan said, wait a minute, what's Jeremiah doing in chains? He's not supposed to be, with the fate of everybody else. They're all being forcibly exiled from the land. Jeremiah, we're supposed to take care of him and give him choices. So he is set free, and the conversation, which we'll see in the subsequent couple of verses, ensues. I want to pause to notice the location, which is Ramah. This gives us an understanding of something that happened about 9 chapters earlier in Jeremiah, which is a famous verse, Jeremiah 31:15. Ko amar Adonai, thus said the Lord. We read this as the Haftarah on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Kol b'Ramah nishma. A voice is heard. Some people translate it on the high place, reading Ramah not as a proper noun, a geographic location, but as a common noun, an elevated, on a high place, or maybe it's a lifted voice is heard. But the prevailing translation is a voice is heard in the place called Ramah. Okay, and what was that voice? Nihi b'chi tamurim, wailing and bitter weeping. Rachel mivaka al baneha, the matriarch Rachel weeping for her children. Me'ana lihinachem al baneha ki einenu. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. What is Jeremiah referring to here? So best guess is he's actually referring to what's being described in this verse. This is an anticipatory prophecy, or maybe it's a reflective back prophecy, but it is referring to the moment where the Jews being exiled from the land of Israel stop off at Ramah as one of their last stops on their way out of the land of Israel, of Canaan. And Rachel, the matriarch, figuratively, is there at that spot, weeping as she sees her children being led away. So it's a famous song and verse called B'Ramah Nishma Rachel Mevakal Baneha, and we ask the question, why Ramah? So now we get the answer to that question, because Ramah was apparently a stopping point on the way out of the land, and Jeremiah, we'll see, actually is able to turn back, but everybody else is not able to turn back. Maybe that's why, even if there were other stopping points, that was a significant stopping point for Jeremiah. At that point, he was being unchained, and he maybe felt, a sense of the weeping for everybody else, because now he was parting ways with them. And they, like the matriarch Rachel, he was seeing them be led off out of the country, and he was going to stay, as we see in the next couple of verses. So that's the setting of Ramah, the location where, and again, in the previous chapter, it seemed like he never was chained, but in this chapter, it seems like he was chained. There's a midrash. See if I can. I don't have the primary source, but the Sansino mentions it that I thought was very powerful. They write, bound in chains. Although Nebuchadnezzar had ordered that the prophet was to be treated with consideration, right? We saw that in the previous chapter. take care of Jeremiah, free him, and he doesn't need to be, endure the fate of everybody else. It is easily understood how the command may have been overlooked in the prevailing confusion. At Ramah, the mistake was rectified, meaning Jeremiah was accidentally just in the, confusion, was put into chains, and it was there at Ramah that it was realized and he was freed. The rabbis declare that, this is again the Sansino comment, the rabbis declare that on seeing the file of chained prisoners, Jeremiah voluntarily had himself fettered to demonstrate his complete identification with the sorrows of his people. I didn't get a chance to see which midrash that's quoting, but we have this rabbinic idea that maybe it was that he was given license to be free, but as he saw everybody else being chained up, rather than say, "Hey, I'm actually exempt," he just put out his hands and was, chained with everybody else until they got to the point that they were actually going to leave the country. And Nebuzaradan said, "Wait a minute, you're not supposed to be, yes." And then Jeremiah said, "Okay, well," and we'll actually see now how did that conversation unfold. So in verse 2. The chief of the guards took him and said, Adonai Elohecha, verse 2, the Lord your God threatened this place with disaster. Diber et hara'ah hazot, spoke of this evil pertaining to this place. And now the Lord has brought it about. Vayavei vayas Adonai kasher diber. Here, by the way, the root that's being repeated here, which is diber and davar. And that's the same word that started off the chapter. Hadavar asher hayal Yirmiyahu me'et Adonai. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, davar. And what now we have in the mouth of the chief of the guards of Nebuzaradan, picking up the same root and saying, the Lord your God spoke of the evil that was going to be carried out. And in fact, God did what God has said in verse 3, because you sinned against the Lord and didn't listen. Lachem hadavar hazeh. And that's why this has happened to you. And so verse 3 ends with hadavar hazeh, which is exactly how verse 1 begins, hadavar, the thing. This leads some people to suggest the answer to the question we asked at the very beginning. What is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah? It's actually what Nebuzaradan, the Chaldean chief of the guard, said to him. In that moment, he was the mouthpiece of the Lord. He was delivering God's prophecies, saying to Jeremiah, this is exactly what the Lord your God said was going to happen. It's happening now because the people have sinned. But now, verse 4, I release you this day from the fetters that are on your hands. And if you want to come with me to Babylon, come and I'll look after you. And if you don't want to come with me to Babylon, chadal, you don't have to. A less common word, but it just means kind of cease. You can be. I'll leave you be, and you don't have to. And look out at this land where you can go wherever it seems right to you to go. So it sounds as though Nebuzaradan is actually delivering a prophecy, which is a very Jeremianic prophecy. He's just repeating to Jeremiah the same things Jeremiah said. This gets us back to the question we asked last week, which is, how did Nebuchadnezzar know that Jeremiah should get special treatment? It seems like we can reinforce that question or partially answer it with this, which is Nebuzaradan also seems to know about the prophecies that Jeremiah was delivering. So we still don't have the answer, but we can get more of an indication that the word was sort of out there, that Jeremiah was the prophet who warned of the destruction and said, if you just submit, you'll escape with your life. And that positively disposed the Chaldeans towards him, because they saw him in some way as an ally. He wasn't an ally with them in a political or religious sense or spiritual sense, but his message was aligned with what was convenient for them. But here Nebuzaradan takes on the religious, tenor of Jeremiah's comments and says, this is what the Lord said, and what you said, is the cause of all of this. And maybe in a sense, because you were trying to convince the people of this from a religious perspective, or maybe just politically because your message was one that was aligned with us, you warrant or get this special treatment, which is that, you can come as a protected individual into the exile in Babylonia, or you can stay here and go where you want to go. Just so the last note before I take a comment is, the language in the end of verse 4, see the whole land is before you, go wherever seems good and right to you. has to me two over or undertones. One is what we read in the Torah portion just a couple weeks ago with Avram and Lot, where they're parting ways, and Avram says the same thing to Lot, look at the land and see where you want to go, and wherever you go, you'll go, and I'll go in the other direction. Very similar language. But it's interesting that the description, normally you would just say El Hatov Be'inecha, wherever is good for you. But Hatov Hayashar, wherever seems good and right to you, that already has like an ethical overtone. We say in the book of Deuteronomy a number of times, Vasita Hayashar Vahatov, do what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord your God. So maybe there's a sort of subtle hint to Jeremiah, who was always prophesying and calling out to the people to do what is good and right, that in some way, as the advocate for justice and and integrity, is another reason why he's being spared, and he's sort of being told you can now go to find your place in the land, sort of in keeping with your attitude of doing what is good and right. So that's sort of the opening. We're about to find out what Jeremiah's decision was in light of this, but we're going to pause for a moment, Mama Toby, and then I think there was another hand. Yep.
I just have a question.
Yep.
In the Hebrew, for the pronoun you, is there a singular and plural? Like, for instance, when he says, you sinned against the Lord and did not obey him. And this is why this is happening to you. Is it singular or is it plural?
It's plural. Katatem, you plural, sin to God. Velo shematem and bekolo, you plural did not heed, and therefore this thing is happening lachem, you
that
plural.
indicates it's the people who sinned.
Yes.
But then it says, now I release you.
That shifts to the singular.
Okay.
Hine fitachticha hayom. Yeah, so it's not clear in the English, but in the Hebrew it's clear that Jeremiah is being told it's the collective sins of all the people that has led to this, but really it reads better, the ve'ata, the transition in verse 4, and now behold, almost is really a but when it comes to you, the individual, I release you. Or maybe kind of, and now in light of that, given that you didn't sin and did heed the Lord, you're going to be released. Is there a question on this side? Okay, Elaine, and then Matt.
I just think it's so interesting that their enemies fancy themselves as the agents of the victim's God. Yeah, I mean, it's not their God, but they propose that.
Yes.
They believe that.
Yes. And is that, one could read that as more kind of conciliatory. That's not exactly the right word, but sort of expressing, this is what the Lord your God, whom we also respect, has said. Or one could read it as more cruel, like, look what your God, we have nothing to do with your God, but like, look at what your own God, has brought upon you. So I think there's sort of different tones that you could read into it, but it is really interesting. And again, one of the, a number of the commentaries say that this is indeed the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah, is the words that Nebuzaradan is recounting. So hold on one second, we'll take Lance's comment and then we'll come to Ruby. Go ahead, Lance.
Okay, first, what is the Hebrew for chief of the guards?
It is here Rav Tabachim.
Okay, shouldn't it be Sartzava?
Why do you say? I mean, Sar Tzava could be officer of the hosts, the large groups, but I don't think there's necessarily only one term for that.
Well, the reference to Rachel indicates that whoever wrote chapter 40 was familiar with Genesis, right?
We got to make a couple steps there. Chapter 40 is referencing chapter 31. Chapter 31 references Rachel, and that would link us back to Genesis. Yeah.
Okay, and number 2, in Tanach, I believe Ramah is a military installation. I can be more precise.
Thank you. I know I could be.
Let's see. Deborah, Saul, Samuel, and David all have references to Ramah as some kind of military installation.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, here it has less of a feel of that, no indication but I don't know whether the choice of place somehow has that in mind. If that maybe the Chaldeans had taken over a military base in Ramah and were operating off of there, so that was a good place to stop on the way out. I don't know. My biblical archaeology and biblical history are not strong enough to answer that off the top of my head. But
In the book of Daniel, aren't the Chaldeans astrologers?
I don't know that either, but I take your
No,
word.
all I'm suggesting here is that we really don't know who wrote chapter 40, and perhaps there were multiple writers, and there's a depth to the. If you ever look at a web page, what most people don't realize is that there are layers to the web page. It's not a flat surface. And I strongly urge you to follow David Weiss Halivni, which indicates for him corruption, but what he really means is Rabbi Zev Farber also, that the text looks flat, but it's really has depth. In other words, it has multiple texts coming in, which I think is true of the Talmud, right? With the system.
Yes. Great.
That's our whole history.
Yes, layers that have been flattened. Yes, hypertext. Yes. Okay, who had hands here? Ruby?
Okay, maybe this is a simplification of history, but is there any historical future benefit for the Jews being exiled to Babylonia?
What might there be?
Just in the future, we would prosper, we would grow as a nation.
Right.
We could always perhaps return, but come back as a stronger people.
Right. Yeah. It's it's a fascinating question. I think it's a question that we only answer in retrospect when we say, looking back, here are the things which we gained in exile, but it's hard to say on the way out that that there was a.
Is that part of God's?
Right.
But excuse me, but when was my ignorance, but when was the Babylonian Talmud written?
Babylonian Talmud was written a good bit later in the first few centuries of the Common Era.
But wouldn't this give rise to if people sort of educated themselves and then rose to that occasion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. How much, I don't know how much of the authors of the Babylonian Talmud were part of a continuous presence in Babylonia, from this time, and how much of them were people who were exiled in the destruction of the Second Temple and made their way to Babylonia and, built diaspora communities there. But I think it is a really interesting question. It's worth noting that one of the key dimensions of the character development in the book of Breshit, of Genesis, is that, and Exodus also, is that the key leaders, patriarchs, and to an extent matriarchs also, have journeys kind of away from the home before they then return to, lead or kind of direct the future. And so I think there is this sort of theme of again, after the fact, because most of the reasons they leave are that they're fleeing, Yaakov fleeing, Esau's going to kill him, or Moshe fleeing because he's in danger for his life from, the involvements he had while he was in Egypt. So, even the story of the development of Judah, the character development of the character Judah, in Genesis, kind of begins with this moment where after the sale of Joseph, it says, Vayered Yehuda me'et Achav. Judah went down from his brothers, and he, goes to elsewhere in the land of Canaan, and then kind of reunites with them. So there does seem to be this theme, this narrative theme of kind of going on your own journey away, only then to return, and somehow having learned something along the way that helps you be a better leader or person, for the future. And so I think, again, that just might be the circumstances of life, but it does develop this idea that there's a power to, going out on your own and coming back as a way of developing some qualities of character that you need for the future. So that's happens on an individual level in Bereshit, and then it seems to happen on national levels, in subsequent eras of Jewish history. Right. Post-Holocaust.
Had
Yep.
life for Jews in Europe years back been so good, our ancestors probably would have never come to the United States.
Right.
So
Right.
was that something that was therefore in the long run a benefit?
Right. Fascinating. I don't think that's a question that can be answered. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the Babylonians took the best, the wealthiest, and probably the best of
Yes.
the Judeans.
Yes.
And benefited.
Yes.
Into their royal court, and,
Right.
and they benefited from them and left the poor
Yeah.
probably uneducated.
Yes. Great. Okay, good points in this first part of the chapter. Were you going to comment? Okay, well, keep on. Yeah, Mama Toby, one more thought before we keep going.
To be as
Ephraim and Menashe. Yep.
Some people believe that, or I've heard, that that's because they sort of returned.
Yes.
to Judaism.
Yes.
Contact.
Yes. They grew up in diaspora and preserved their identities and then kind of returned. That's like a feature of Ephraim and Menashe, and so maybe that's why we bless our children that way. Yeah, Graham, go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, let's see. In the beginning of the chapter, the word of the Lord never came, right?
Not explicitly.
Right. So maybe the message, well, the message to me is that actions speak louder than words, even for the voice of God. So, I mean, he said, I'm set free, but as long as other of my brothers and sisters are in chains, then I am in chains. Like
Yeah.
it's a variation on, if my friend is unhappy, then I am unhappy.
Mhm.
So, this telling me that, especially again in the beginning of the chapter, that events and actions have a voice of their own, and God's actions speak louder than God's words, even.
Yes.
The counsel to me from this is that if you can't listen to what I say, just watch what I do.
Yeah.
So, and then, well, I don't know if this is inappropriate to say, but projecting Jeremiah into the trials and the tribulations of the Holocaust, it's a dilemma between individual survival and community survival. Like I fleshed on what it might have been like for the very few people that were left behind when the rest of his people during the Holocaust were taken away, and so like what is good and right is to say, without my community, I do not exist.
Yeah.
So there might have been a few of his community and family that had been missed, and that feeling of regret, survivor's guilt. If everyone was taken away, why was I not taken away? And Jeremiah may have thought, what good is my life if my community and family have been exiled?
Yeah.
And it might be a transposition from this far, in the distant past set of events, and something a little bit closer to the modern day.
That's a
Nice.
that's
I like
a
that.
good point.
Yes, and I appreciate that sort of reading of the word of the Lord, that it might not have, maybe we're looking in the wrong place if we're looking for, speech, but that there's something of kind of action or modeling that we want to look for. Again, I think the classical reading is that there are words, but we don't have those words, so we have to search for something else. So one possibility is it's the words of Nebuzaradan, but maybe there's a different way to look at it as well. All right, let's go. I see Lance's hand. Let's go on a little bit more. 10:44. So bear with me. We'll try to remember what you wanted to share, Lance, because we'll happy to circle back to it once we get a little further on. Okay, so we're in verse 5. So we're in the midst of the words of Nebuzaradan's comments to Jeremiah, saying, you can come with me to Babylon or you can stay. And then we have this, beginning of verse 5, V'odenu lo yashuv. Still, he did not turn back. You see the little letters A that say meaning of Hebrew uncertain. It's kind of a strange little interpolation. Some people suggest that actually this is the word of God, that it's in the middle of Nebuzaradan's kind of offers to Jeremiah, that God says to him, he should not, you should not return, or he should still not return. That was kind of the instructions to Jeremiah, like don't go with the people out. It's very, very opaque, but seems like the main point is that Yirmiyahu is a little bit frozen. He's sort of not going in, he's not returning, he's not going forward. And then it seems like, again, the way JPS is explaining it and the way many of the commentaries go, Nebuzaradan's offer continues. A third possibility, right? You can go with me to Babylonia and I'll take good care of you. You can just go where you want in the country. Or you can go to Gedaliah, son of Achikam, son of Shaphan, right, who the king of Babylon put in charge of the towns of Judah, and you can stay with him amongst the people, or go where you want to go. And then again, we get not even a narration that says Jeremiah did not go anywhere. We get nothing, just get silence, right? The halfway point, not by words, but in content of the verse comes with the end of this quote, go wherever you want to go. O kol hayashar beinach lechet lech. Nothing. And then it just says that the chief of the guards gave him some food and sent him on his way. It's like Jeremiah almost seems like, for the person who was not at a loss for words most of the time, delivering the words of God, he's got nothing to say. He's just sort of stuck. He's frozen. He doesn't return. He doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't say anything. And it almost seems like it takes the Rav Tabachim saying, well, okay, I guess you're not coming with us. So just go back, whatever it is. There's this, dramatic absence from Jeremiah in this moment. Yes, Mama Toby says beautifully. It echoes the absence of the word of God, right? Jeremiah is waiting for some instruction, but the word of the Lord from the Lord doesn't come. It seems to come through Nebuzaradan as we're reading it. And then Jeremiah is sort of saying, okay, God, what am I supposed to do? And there's no answer. So he's just standing there. And again, he has no recourse but to kind of follow Nebuzaradan in place of the word of the Lord, who says, okay, so take some food and go back into Judea. And that's what he does. And in verse 6, we're told that he comes to Gedaliah ben Achikam to Mitzpah. I think that's also a military location, with a lot of history from different points in the books of the prophets. And we have this phrase again that repeats from verse 5, Vayeshev ito betoch ha'am. This is an important point, because when you read that Jeremiah comes to Gedaliah, who's assigned to be the king or the governor or whatever it is, you might think that he was sort of taking up office in the palace or in whatever governor's quarters Gedaliah was in. But it says Vayeshev ito, he stayed with him, so he's kind of in Gedaliah's care or continuing in relationship with him. But how so? Betoch ha'am hanisharim ba'aretz, amongst the people who were left in the land. And that echoes what we saw in the previous chapter, in the chapter 39, verse 14, once where it says that Jeremiah was put into the care of Gedaliah ben Achikam, and it says, Vayeshev betoch ha'am, he dwelt amongst the people. And this has very much the feeling, I think there's two dimensions to it. One, this goes back to what we often say about the prophet being caught in between or holding the tension of the relationship with God on the one hand, and the relationship with the people on the other hand. So maybe Vayeshev betoch ha'am is kind of further indicative of the cessation of communication with God. Now he kind of went back to being one of the people because his connection to God was, dissipated. Is that because, his mission was over? So there wasn't we don't necessarily want to say he failed, but he did everything he could do and there was nothing left to do So kind of God hung up the phone. Was it indicative of, a different way of saying it, which is that God went into exile? This is the rabbis have this idea. God went into exile with those who had gone off into Babylonia. So, God was elsewhere at this time, and it was almost like a division of labor. God went into exile with the people. Jeremiah stayed in the land with the people, and he was sort of holding up that position, but without the direct line to God. Or maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe it actually means that he continued, and we don't necessarily have words of God right now, but he continued in his prophetic vein, doing what a prophet is supposed to do, which is to be amidst the people, not amidst the people having, given up his position, but continuing to be communicating with the people, wearing his prophetic hat or robe or whatever the metaphor might be. So he is betoch ha'am hanisharim ba'aretz, that remain in the land. We're just gonna zip through to the end of the chapter and then take additional comments. Meanwhile, we're told that a whole bunch of military folks heard that Gedaliah had been put in charge, and that he had, control over the remaining Judeans who had not been exiled to Babylonia. That's verse 7. And so they kind of came. Did they come because they were seeking his care? Did they come because they wanted positions of authority? These were, seemed like they were remaining men who might have tried to fight and defend the land. So they were coming back to sort of check in with the new leader. Did they want to try to wrest control from Gedaliah? We don't have clarity of it yet, but we start to see it. But the military leaders come back to Gedaliah, having heard that he's in charge, of the remaining Judean presence, and he tells them, and here it sounds like maybe Jeremiah. While we don't see Jeremiah communicating with Gedaliah, Gedaliah gives a message which feels very Jeremiah-esque, which is, stay the course, serve the Chaldeans, just submit, and everything will be okay. I'm gonna literally, Gedaliah, the governor, I'm literally gonna serve the Chaldeans. I'm gonna take care of them. And you feel free. You could join me in that role if you want. You can be an additional, vassal servant to the Chaldean leadership. Or, you can just know that I've got that covered in verse 10, and you can kind of gather up some things for the winter and settle down in the areas which you have occupied. Now, it's interesting, that term in the end of verse 10, Ba'arechem asher tifastem, the lands you have occupied. Is it indicative of the fact that somehow they retained a little bit of control over some little towns even after the Chaldean conquest? Or does it just mean the ones you managed to live in, even though you couldn't conquer them? It's a strange little phrase there. Normally, litvos means to take hold of in the end of verse 10, and in the English has it that you've occupied. Hard to tell exactly what it's referring to. And then just like the military folk who were in the land heard about Gedaliah, so too the Judeans who were already dispersed into other places besides Babylonia heard about, Gedaliah, and that he was in charge, and was, there were Judeans remaining. And in this kind of remarkable verse, in verse 12, Vayashuvu chol haYehudim mikol hamekomot asher nidchu sham. All the dispersed Judeans returned from the places they had dispersed to, and they came to Gedaliah, and they vayasfu yain b'kayitz harbei mod. They gathered up, and settled down. So we have this, like, immediately after the exile and the great destruction, we have this mini return, and it's there to kind of, set up and dramatize what's going to come after, which is the ultimate final downfall. But in this moment, we have this little sense, okay, not all is lost. Yes, there was the big destruction and the big exile, but also now there is an, assigned governor, and things seem to be stable for the moment. And even people who had fled to various places now returned and settled down as a minority population in the land. No, temple has been destroyed. Again, even though it doesn't say it in this version, but it has been destroyed. And now Yochanan, in the last narrative dimension of this chapter, Yochanan, son of Kareach, and all the officers of the troops, the remaining defeated military, Judean military, come to Gedaliah, and they say, King Baalis of Ammon sent Yishmael, son of Netaniah, to kill you. Yishmael, son of Netaniah, who was one of those military figures that we read about in verse 8. So he was part of it, but he seems to have been co-opted by the king of Ammon, which is a neighboring region. And perhaps the king of Ammon thought, maybe I can get my hands on this little region in Judea if I can, depose or assassinate the Judean king there. Again, how would the Babylonians have looked upon that? Unclear, but he saw a potential opening for a little power grab, this king of Ammon, and needed to assassinate Gedaliah, and seemed to have, brought on board for that one of the military figures from the defeated Judeans, and others got word of it and went to Gedaliah and said, "This is happening. There's a plot to kill you." But v'lo ha'amin lahem Gedaliahu ben Achikam. He didn't believe it. And not only did Yochanan, son of Kareach, in verse 13, warn him, in 14, warn him about this, but then he said, "Listen, let me take care of this for you. Let me preemptively strike down Yishmael ben Netaniah, just like, mafia kind of moment. I'll get rid of this guy. No one will be the wiser, and the plot to assassinate you will be diffused. If not, v'nafotzu kol Yehuda hanikbatzim elecha v'avda she'erit Yehuda." Pretty, somber note here. If Yishmael ben Netaniah succeeds in killing you, then this little moment that we're living in of a tiny bit of hope of all the dispersed Judeans returning is going to be over, and they're going to be dispersed again. And these three heavy words, Avda She'erit Yehuda, the remnant of Judah will perish. Gedaliah simply says, no, don't do that. Ki sheker ata dover el Yishmael. You're certainly speaking lies about Yishmael. We come back to that word, dover, that came back at the very beginning of the chapter, of the word of the Lord, and that which you are saying, came to pass. Here it's, this is, not that that Yochanan ben Kareach is a prophet, but in a sense we have this moment where the king is dismissive of, an important message which is being brought to him, and he treats it as falsehood when it's true, kind of similar to the way in which a lot of the kings treated the true prophets' words as false when really they were true. And it's on that kind of cliffhanger of lack of trust, lack of belief, an unwarranted optimism that we leave the chapter. Ellen and then Lance. Yeah, Yishmael seems to be a Judean. Yep, the various names are Judean names and places. Yeah.
Jeremiah seems to have disappeared from this entire narrative.
Yep.
I mean, but the other Judeans are almost picking up where he should have.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're sort of giving the warnings now.
Yeah.
Whereas it should have been him.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting, exactly as you said. We could imagine, if this had been left blank and you had to fill in the blank, who came to Gedaliah to warn him about a plot to kill him, we would expect it to be Jeremiah. So what does that say to us? I think it's very well noticed, given that we're in the book of Jeremiah and therefore the story is being told from the perspective of Jeremiah. He's noticeably absent. We'll see him, circle back in a little while, but yes, one has to wonder exactly kind of the different options we rate.
Why?
Is he, did he lose that divine channel? Is he just traumatized and and unable to get up and do things? Sort of right. Is he kind of licking his wounds from feeling like he just witnessed, the final, the last straw, or the final, nail in the coffin, so to speak, of his attempts to, rescue the people. But yeah, the comment is spot on that what's most glaring about this narrative right now is the absence of Jeremiah from it, and we'll have to see how he comes back when, and then we'll be able to answer even more kind of, can we understand why he was gone during this time? Lance, go ahead.
Okay, the key phrase for me is by the waters of Babylon. And that comes from Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is actually Zionism. What it says is when the Jews go to Babylon, the most important thing is that they do not assimilate, that they remember that they're Jews and they remember Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, and this ties in with what Graham said, I think, Stephen Vincent Benet wrote a short story before, in about 1938, called by the Waters of Babylon, in which he foresaw an apocalyptic great fire. And that has been interpreted as either a nuclear war or the Holocaust.
Uh-huh. Thank you for raising and thinking about those powerful applications. Yes. Did I neglect anybody who wanted to comment? Looking back on Zoom for a minute. Great. Okay. So we will await the next chapter literally in 2 weeks of what happens to Gedaliah, what happens to the remnant of the Judeans, and coming back to Ellen's important point, where is Jeremiah and why? I think a powerful chapter to kind of reflect on the demise of the people, the demise of the word of the Lord. In what way was it being channeled through the Chaldeans? And these sort of key terms about returning or not returning, Jeremiah's sort of frozenness, and where we're going from here. So thanks everybody, and wishing a happy Thanksgiving. I'll be in Baltimore, but always reach out if you need anything.
How's your mom? How's your mom?
Thank you for asking. Coming along. I was there yesterday, and her recovery continues to progress. So thanks for her and your thoughts. Yep. All right. Be well, everybody. Have a great day.
Okay. Happy Thanksgiving. Take
Yeah,
care.
and good Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yep.
Yeah,
You too.
be nice.